One of the biggest disputes over whether people should marry young, and people on the side who say that getting married young is more irresponsible, would be the comment of your prefrontal cortex is not completely fully developed yet. It doesn't develop till you're 25 years old. And so you may literally want a completely different life once that prefrontal cortex is developed. Now, as someone who is 23 years old, I got married at 21. I want to chat a little bit about this idea of the prefrontal cortex and the development of that and what that implicates on perhaps a marriage. Obviously, we do see some statistics that show that people who get married young, now, granted, when they do these statistics, a lot of times it's like anywhere from 17, 18 until like 24 or 25. So we do have to take in consideration, like, these are people who are like 23, 24 years old, also being lumped into the statistical sample with people who are like 17, 18, 19 years old. So I think that that's kind of a consideration too. But we do see that there is a higher divorce rate in people who are exceedingly on that younger side when they get married. Of course, everyone is an individual, and the divorce rate, actually, when you look at it, it's not that much higher than the general divorce rate of people just in the rest of age ranges who are getting divorced as well. So it's not actually that much more than what everyone else does, but because it is a little bit more, a lot of people will then say, you know what, your prefrontal cortex isn't developed. Wait till it's developed before you get married. You need to know who you are as a person before you get married. And so you need to wait till you're like 25, and then you can get married. Then you're all clear to go. Do whatever you want in life. I will say, from my experience, I know people and I have seen people who they mature a lot from the ages of maybe like 20, 21, 22 until 25, 26. And it's amazing how much there's a lot at play in that development. Like, all of a sudden they're like immature and crazy and doing these crazy things. And then as they grow older, you're like, oh my goodness, like, they're an actual adult. They're making responsible decisions, and they like have this job that they're pursuing, and they have this life that they're pursuing, and they're a lot deeper in their thoughts and in their actions and just in their character. But on the other hand, also in my experience, I have also seen a lot of people who from the ages of like 16 to 20 have a huge transformation in which they become a lot deeper thinkers. They have a huge transition in their life, and they really genuinely know who they are. They're kind of very secure and confident in what they want to do in life. I just want to pause right here and remind you to hit that subscribe button if you are enjoying this conversation. I talk about living intentionally, rooted in God's word, and concepts like marriage, pregnancy, motherhood, and just general topics related to that. And some of them get married at that age, or some of them wait till they're a bit old, not at 16, but at like, maybe 19, 20, 21, those ages. And some of them wait till they're a bit older, but they still, that transformation, when it happens, it's still in that like more so 16 to 20-ish range rather than that 20 to 25 range. And so even just experientially in my own life, seeing different people go through this transition at different times. Now, that's not to say that either people like stop complete growth as an individual. However, I can even speak for myself when I say, have I grown a lot since I was probably 16 or 17 years old? Absolutely. But at the foundational core of who I was when I was 16, I would say that the majority of what I believed, who I am, what I wanted out of life, my goals, a lot of that has really not changed. Now, some application of that may be a little bit different here or there in different scenarios of life or whatever. But for the most part, who I was at 16, my core values, kind of who I wanted to be in life, my goals for my life, a lot of that was already set by the time I was 16. Now, for a lot of people, they don't know that at 16. They're not ready for that at 16. But I think for me, like genuinely and truly, the majority of who I am, who I've always wanted to be, what I'm passionate about, while there's been development within all of those cases and growth within that, it hasn't foundationally necessarily changed. Now, another thing I will say is that something that many people don't necessarily understand is that in general, human beings are not necessarily fixed creatures. Like, just because you turn a specific number, I think they say for girls it's like around 23 for your prefrontal cortex, and for guys around 25. Take it with a grain of salt. Like, whatever age it could be, it might differ from individual to individual. But when that does happen, that does not mean that you are now a fixed human being. You will never change. Nothing in your life will ever shake you. Like, you are just who you are. And I think that that's so important, because that's something that my parents and other older people, like grandparents and other individuals in my life, really emphasize is like, you will and should be continuing to grow. Maybe not in as big of ways, but you should be continuing to grow throughout your life, rather than just coming to this fixed point in time and being like, well, this is just who I am and nothing about me will ever change. Now, there might be a good portion of things that they really don't change, or maybe they change in a small way or adjust, but your character should always continue to grow. Hopefully, Lord willing, you're continuing to grow closer to God if you are a Christian. If you are not a Christian, I hope that you are putting yourself in situations where your character is continuing to grow. Not everyone does that. I think a lot of people nowadays do not like necessarily the ideas of like commitment and fidelity and growth as a person, and aren't necessarily trying to invest in their character and find ways in which they can be more selfless and be more patient and be more kind, be more generous, and be more just a better person overall to contribute to the world. Some people, it takes them longer. And I even think there's some people, like, I still look at them at 30 years old and they are still having a drastic amount of growth that needs to happen in their life. So the whole idea, in my opinion, and granted, I am 23, so you could even say, even though I am a girl, you could even say, well, maybe your prefrontal cortex isn't developed yet. Maybe when you're 25, I'll completely change my mind and deconstruct everything I ever knew. But this whole idea is that we're continuing to grow and develop throughout all of life. And part of being married is that you are choosing that person to grow with as an individual. So if your foundation is, this is a commitment that I am making for my entire life to marry this person, we are going to grow together. And even if we might disagree on some things, or we might have arguments, or we might have stressors that are unique to us, maybe because we're younger or whatever, you're still choosing to grow with that person. I think in the same way, and this is just from what I've seen, this is also from what people that I'm close to have seen in their circles, when you do get married a lot older especially, it can bring different challenges to the marriage than maybe people who are married a little bit younger. For instance, for me, I was a fairly secure person in and of myself and who I was and the goals that I wanted as a person by the time I was 21. I met my husband when he was 21. And so I think he has had a lot of different changes. I should not say a lot, but there have been some adjustments that he's made and just changes in which he's grown maybe more from the age of like 21 to the age of 23 incrementally than maybe I grew from the age of 21 to the age of 23, just because of the way in which, like, at the point I was 21, like, I was pretty secure in who I was and everything like that. I was more of a stubborn person. Like, I kind of always have known who I am and haven't struggled with internal, it's not that I haven't struggled with internal conflict, but I have walked through steps to resolve that and figure out fairly quickly, more so, who I am, if that's how you want to portray it, and like what my goals are. I would say that there's still a lot of goals that even at 21, my husband had a lot of goals that he still absolutely is still working towards at 25 now. So to say too that he's a completely different person at 25 than 21, well, yes, he's changed in some ways perhaps and adjusted in a little bit, but he's not necessarily a completely different person at 25 than who he was at 21. And we got married when he was 23, by the way. So 23 to 25, we've been married. And I think the important part here is that there are people who are older and they're more secure. They're so confident and secure in themselves and maybe a little bit more stubborn. And they actually, because of that fact, then have a harder time with getting married to someone, because at that point that person's a bit different than them. Like, they haven't had the chance to grow together in those areas, and so you're having to marry someone who's in many cases maybe a bit different than you and having to compromise a lot more. Whereas for maybe people who get married younger, my husband, other people that I know who've even gotten married even younger, like, they've been able, it hasn't really been a compromise for them because they've just been figuring out those things together throughout their life. Like having, like when they're having children or something. I have a friend who has 2 children, and she, you know, got married at, I don't know, 19 or 20. She was probably almost 20, I think. But she and her husband then worked together to kind of figure a lot of these things out in their marriage. And not to say that they're like having this perfect marriage or like it's so much nicer, but because they've worked together to kind of forge their own path, I think that they then disagree on a lot less items than maybe a couple who gets married when they're 30 years old, who they already have a ton of preconceived notions about everything that they want for the course of their life by that point. And so at that point, it's a lot harder because you can come into a lot more conflict of disagreement when both people are like, I really want this and I really want that, and there's compromise that has to happen. Whereas I think when you're younger, there is a little bit more malleability of, you know, let's make this choice and choose it together. Overall, from a personal perspective, I would say I'm still a stubborn person, and I think if I had waited till I was any older, I would be that much more set in my ways and a little bit more stubborn. And I think it would have been harder for me to have gotten married at much, much older, even just a little bit older than what I was at 21. I think that marriage definitely makes you have to choose to be a better person, a more selfless person, someone who is living for this other human being as well as yourself and structuring everything around that, and certainly compromising in some ways, but like I said, working towards growth together. And I think that there's a lot of just character growth that comes with that. I think that it just genuinely, it changes you and makes you kind of be perhaps a little bit more of a steady, grounded person who's like, okay, like I'm trying to make these decisions and like be responsible, rather than just a single person who can do whatever they want whenever they want without having to talk with another person or without having their spouse to kind of push back on some of those options. At the end of the day, I do really think it's a personal decision as to when people choose to marry. I think that as a culture, we need to do a lot better job of setting teenagers up for success to know who they are. I think my parents did a good job of encouraging me to ask questions about life, to think about my goals, to think about what I wanted out of life. Not that they were like pressuring me to do any specific way, but like any specific choice or whatever. But they're like, okay, like, you need to be thinking about your worldview. You need to be thinking about your core beliefs, your core values, what you really want. What do you want in a marriage? What do you want for your life? How do you want your, like, if you have children, how do you want that to look like? And I think they always did a good job of asking us those questions. And especially as we got older, like when we were very young, they still actually talked with us over a lot of different things, even when we were like super young. But as we got older too, especially, they talked over these things with us. And sometimes we would disagree with like whatever the way our parents approached something, but they very much taught us to think critically about, me and my siblings, to think critically about what we wanted and where our values lied and what we actually genuinely believed. And if there were reasons behind that, and that we should have reasons behind why we believe what we believe. So I think that really helped set me and my siblings up for success, because we kind of had a little bit of an edge over some other teenagers who maybe like their parents just sat there and were like, oh my goodness, like, I'm terrified, my teen's doing this, they're going crazy, and they're just, out of my control, or whatever the case might be. They kind of set us up with people who would also... My parents set us up with people who would also like be encouraging for our growth and would also be asking us those same questions, rather than just trying to. I think a lot of parents can go into the restrict mode of like, no, you're not allowed to do that yet. Like, I don't want my teenager, freaking out or like going crazy. And so they kind of restrict. Whereas a lot of the families and my parents and like the way that they allowed us to like, hey, think critically over this, have a reason, like come to me with the logical reason, and then great, do your thing, have your belief, whatever that the case might be after that happens. And I think that avoided a lot of stress, a lot of tension that could have happened. And maybe it produced some other types of tension too, but it really allowed us to think for ourselves, to make mistakes for ourselves, to grow within ourselves, rather than just constantly being like, oh my goodness, my teenager like won't put on their hat when they go outside. And it's like, okay, well, maybe they don't need a hat when they go outside. Like maybe that's their choice that they can make, that they're fully capable of making. Maybe your 10-year-old doesn't need you to put their hat on. Like, maybe there's a lot of incremental steps that we can take to try to set people up for success, for making their own choices for life. And I do think that is very beneficial. A lot of people that I know, like I said, between 16 and kind of 20 years old, they really had a lot of growth that happened. And some of them, they still might have some areas in which they're gonna continue to grow, because everyone should be continuing to grow throughout their life. So at the end of the day, I think get married when you want to get married. Just have a foundation of who you are, and then be willing to grow and change alongside another human being, because that's what marriage is. You're committing your life to a human being who is also a sinful, fallen human being and not perfect, but be willing to have those foundations in place so that way you can come across the same conclusions and be on the same page and be ready to start your life off together in a fantastic way. Thanks so much for listening. Be sure to give this a like if you enjoyed it.